Thank you so much, Steffi. It's really incredible what you've created here. So, as Steffi mentioned, I study storytelling because I do believe that we are fundamentally storytelling animals. We use stories to understand the world and our relation to it. And this is why it matters so terribly much what kinds of stories we tell. And so I've been studying storytelling from various perspectives, including in relation to the environment. Oh, this is the wrong PowerPoint, but it doesn't matter. So I'll just be talking to you directly. And so when it comes to storytelling, and none of you will be surprised by this, the overwhelmingly most dominant story is the apocalyptic disaster narrative. We humans seem to love that story, and it will be interesting to speculate, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a second, why that story is so satisfying and so popular. Because that story dominates our imagination, I and the group of people I work with decided to trace it back to its origin in order to understand where it comes from. And to our surprise, it turns out it's basically the oldest story in the world. It first appears in the oldest written text in world history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, with roots about 4,000 years ago. And it's from there that it was rewritten. It returned into the Hebrew Bible, into the Old Testament, into the Quran, all the way to today's Hollywood disaster narratives. And it's interesting to think about where it originates. So it originates in southern Iraq, what's today Iraq, which is also, and in the context of this conference, interesting to note that this is where the first city in the world emerged. That's exactly where the Epic of Gilgamesh and this disaster story is set. It's also where intensive agriculture originates. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the flood is paired with another story, namely the beginning of an extractive economy where we look at the environment as a resource to be used. In this case, for city building, there's a logging expedition, and then as a punishment, the story of the flood. So the takeaway here is that many of the topics we've been talking about today, including the very first talk, urbanization, this morning, and about different forms of agriculture, have their origin 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. And the takeaway point here is that it shows, in some sense, what we are up against. So we are not just up against industrialization or the origin of capitalism or any of the forces that we are grappling with today. In some ways, the story of an extractive economy and as a punishment, an apocalyptic disaster that gets visited upon us is as old as human civilization itself. So that's sort of the depressing part. It just shows how deeply wired into human imagination that story is and how, therefore, how hard it is to dislodge it, which is why it keeps being repeated over and over again, except, I want to say, here at DLD, because it's been great today to hear to what extent this story is not the dominant one here, but it's in most other discourses. That's what it is. So what we need to do is move beyond that disaster story, and this is, I think, Andrew and I, what we will be talking about, how we can move beyond that story, and what kinds of stories we should tell instead. So let's engage in a conversation about that.
Oh, close. Not too close.
We can hold hands.
Oh, yes. We're not in Cambridge. So Martin, thank you so much for that. Well, there seems to be two narratives here on offer at DLD. And we had it with the guy from Amsterdam who did his Sinatra impersonation of the world as linear or circular. Are we trying to replace the linear apocalyptic story with a circular story? You and I have been talking all day about Nietzsche and his idea of the eternal return. Is that what a circular narrative is? And there was a lady before lunch who talked about Buddhism and her calling there. Is this Buddhism versus Christianity version 2.0?
You know, it could be. I mean, it's interesting to think about what a circular story would be, because as everyone knows, a story is something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But that's not circular. That's, in some sense, linear. So what would be a story type with a beginning, a middle, and a return? And I think it's something we've all been sort of grappling with today, and I started to make a list of all the terms that we've been used: regenerative, recycling, refill. You know, there have been about, I think I have 6 or 7 terms, and you know, terms are not stories, but they are building blocks or concepts that could be turned into stories. So I don't think we have quite figured out yet how to make stories circular in a way that would map onto the circular economy, but I think that's the task.
And again, coming back to your beginning, why do stories matter? Why are they so attractive to us? It's, again, one of the cliches of events like this. Everyone always talks about, we're all storytellers, we need to tell each other stories, but why? Why do we obsess over stories?
I do think that it's, you know, stories for us carry sort of implicit models of the world. They carry models of agency and also motivation. But that can also misfire. They can misdirect us often. And so one of the things I've also been thinking about today is that almost all stories from world history are stories of an individual hero. The hero's journey, that's sort of the model type that's certainly very influential in Hollywood and many other places. And it's very clear that, you know, no hero will save us. And so one of the other tasks, besides the kind of circular story structure, if you will, is to think about stories of collective agency. And it's striking how few of those there are. And I hate to mention this in this company, but one of the few texts I know that's been very influential about collective agency is the Communist Manifesto. And you know, I don't think communism will save us, but it's interesting to see where these models are, and they're very few and far between. But that's sort of collective agency, and I think the sense of collectivity, I think, is a red thread that ran throughout the day today.
You mentioned agency, this idea that we make our own, talking of Marx and the manifesto, we make our own history. Marx famously said, not in the manifesto, but in another work, we make it in ways that we don't expect. In other words, we don't really make our own histories. Yeah. What about making our own stories? And you know, we can get stuck into the notion of history and stories. Should we expect to make our own stories, Martin, or are we always going to be making stories that we don't quite expect?
That's interesting. I mean, it's certainly hard to imagine making stories out of whole cloth. You know, we've always been sort of recycling, to use that term, stories and story bits, and this is why I've been, you know, tempted to go back into the long history of storytelling, you know, 5,000 years of written stories. We have an incredible archive of stories. And while many of them are, you know, misleading, like apocalyptic stories, the hero's journey, there are also other stories that we can now return to and maybe be inspired by. So I do think that, you know, we have agency here, but maybe, you know, to modify your Marx quote, we make history, but not as we please. That is, there are constraints, there are material circumstances. We can't just sort of change everything overnight. And that's very much another theme of the entire day today. But I think we have some agency, and everyone who is in the storytelling industry, and in some ways we all are, participate in it. But it's a collective act, and it's not down to one person.
How do we get beyond the end of stories? Fukuyama, of course, famously wrote in '89 about the end of history, couldn't have been more wrong. How do we prolong the narrative about the environment? My sense is, just as we long for apocalyptic stories with terrible endings, we also, and we have Hollywood here as an example, we long for stories with happy endings. But of course, there is no ending, and when it comes to the environment, I had a guy on my show who wrote a book called Cobalt Red, which is about this new slave economy in the Congo as a result of our enormous thirst now for battery power. How do we teach people that nature never has an ending, that there is no end, there is no Hollywood finale where everyone goes home happy and we fix this thing?
Yeah. I think this question of ending is, is one of the appeals, the paradoxical appeals of apocalyptic stories, because it deals with, it deals with uncertainty. Uncertainty is very hard if you don't know how it's going to end. And so I think for some people, and in certain situations, knowing what the end will be like, or imagining that you know what the end will be like, even if it's disastrous, has a kind of calming or soothing or even satisfying effect. So it seems to me that the task is to deal with, in terms of stories, with uncertainty, as you say, with an open future. I mean, this is another form of ending, but I sometimes feel that maybe we need more climate comedies. I mean, I'm looking at Doris Day, who's a great comedian, in part because comedies is the genre of human frailty, of failing, of humility, of material circumstances that we can't master. And yes, it's also a genre of happy endings, but if I think about the kind of storytelling resources from history that we haven't been using when it comes to the environment, I would say comedy is one of them. And not because climate change is ha-ha funny, but because, as I said, there's something very human about these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I had a guy on my podcast, I can't remember his name, who wrote a book about treating the environment as dark comedy. Mm-hmm. So where do we need to go with stories, Martin? We don't have a lot of time left. Do we want to encourage or discourage the telling of stories when it comes to this so-called circular economy, which perhaps isn't quite as circular as we'd all like to think?
I, for my part, don't think it's a matter of storytelling or not storytelling, because I think we can't help it. I don't even know what it would mean like to stop telling stories. I mean, I think we generate them almost automatically. So this is why I think it's a question of what kind of stories. So I very much am in favor of a very deliberate approach to storytelling, because we often, I think, we have these stories floating around in our minds, and they come from fairy tales, they come from Hollywood, they come from a million, from newspapers, they come from a million places, and often we don't fully, I mean, even I study storytelling, I study, oh yes, oh, that's where the story comes from. Oh, this is assumption that is behind this kind of way of presenting events. So I don't think it's a matter of whether to tell stories or not. I think we always do. It's a question of what kinds of stories. So I think, as we've been saying, being very critical of disaster stories, not just because they are false, but also because they breed, inaction. They give a false sense of certainty.
Yeah, we give up our agency. And finally, what about the role of technology? Of course, we've got the AI event tomorrow. Can technology, or should technology, help with the telling of stories? Are machines going to be better than we are at telling stories? And I'm not a great fan of the word collaborative, but social media was supposed to be all about the collaboration of storytelling. Is technology the problem or the fix?
I think it's going to be part of it, whether we want it or not, and that's probably okay. Because, if you go back into the deep history of our species, you could say even, or you could make an argument that even language is, in some sense, a technology of communication we evolved. There are debates on either side of that.
Did we have stories before language, or did language come out of stories? Or is that the chicken and the egg, shall we say?
It's interesting. I mean, you certainly, I guess you can put images in sequences. It's very hard to say, but language is certainly a storytelling tool, a very powerful one. And then writing came along. That's undoubtedly a technology, and we've been using that. And that, of course, changed how stories circulate, but also what kinds of stories get told with the advent of paper and print in China and the reinvention of print. So, storytelling has existed in a technological world always. Now, since November, we've always all been amazed to what extent AI can actually generate stories. But of course, this generation is also based on all the stories we have produced and fed into it. So it is a collaboration, and I don't think it makes sense to me to say, oh, storytelling is this human, organic, authentic activity, and then we need to keep technology at a distance. Let's not, spoil it or something like that. I think that's naive and just historically not.
We've got to bring this story to an end. Excuse, I couldn't resist that one, Martin. But 3 takeaways from here. How should people be telling the story of the collaborative economy to manifest our own agency in the way that we will shape the world rather than the world shaping us as Marx dreamt in the 19th century?
Yeah. Well, I would say the first is stories of human collective action. That's the most important one. And as I said, there are very few models, and it's hard to achieve, but that's one task. Comedies. I think we need more climate change comedies. And then what you started with, since we're talking about the circular, what kinds of storytelling would be possible that are not beginning, middle, and end, but has built into it all the rewords that we've been using: rechargeable, return, recycling, regenerative. That, I think, those are the building blocks of the kinds of stories we need.
Well, that's the story, or maybe we should say the re-story. Martin Puchner, thank you so much.